Right, hello everyone. Welcome back. I hope you've all had a delicious lunch and are feeling ready to go, re-energized. Welcome to third parallel session on the first day of the Working Class Academics Conference 2021. I can see people coming in, so I think we're just about on time. So let's get started. Firstly, my name is Andrew Preater. I am chairing today. I'm a librarian and I work in a modern university in London. I'm from a working class background, and one of my passions in my professional practice is equity and widening participation work. So I assume, like many of us today, I found this already such an infusing and enriching conference. So very much looking forward to what our speakers have for you today and the remainder of the conference. But today really is about our speakers and their stories, and I'll hand over to them promptly. I will now hand over to our first speaker, that is Garry Nicholson, and his talk is titled Bildung, Biker, and Bollocks to Being Functional. So that is over to you, Garry.
Right, so my name's Garry Nicholson. My title's already been given. I come from a slightly separate view on the class system, in that I grew up with my dad in the armed forces. So my dad was the son of a barber from Newcastle, and my mum the daughter of a coal man from Scarborough. But my dad decided to join the Air Force. So I kind of like lived within two class systems. I had the class systems of my relatives, and also anybody who knows anything about the armed forces, that if you are in the lower ranks of the armed forces, you live in shabby houses, and if you're an officer, you live in nice smart houses in separate areas. You drink in different places, you live in different places, and it's kind of like the class system magnified. What it gave me was a lifelong attitude problem towards rules and the establishment, because my house was full of rules all of the time. And also, I've heard lots of people talk today about kind of identity and where you come from. And I've lived in 24 houses in my life and umpteen different places. So actually, when people ask me the question, where do you come from? I kind of like really struggle to answer the question, because and I've had this conversation with other people who were children who grew up in the armed forces, that you begin to feel like you don't really come from anywhere other than the house that you happen to be living in. So that's a little bit about me. Right, my talk today is a little bit of a mix of philosophy, history, and a teaching experience that hopefully binds it all together. So what I'll do is I'll crack on now. Bildung. Some people around the country know me as Garry Bildung, because I'm researching this particular area, and most people have never heard of it. So if I give you a rundown on what Bildung actually is, or otherwise the rest of this presentation won't make any sense at all. Bildung comes from, well, originally it comes from the ancient Greeks, but it was a philosophy that was developed during the German Enlightenment. And the idea behind it is that to be a fully developed person, you need to develop your Bildung. So actually the word Bildung means self-formation. And the best way to think of it is that in every interaction with another person, every time you read a book, every time you go somewhere, you're constantly learning, and all of those experiences go together almost in a lifelong learning passport, which never comes to an end, that develops you socially and culturally. And it's almost the opposite of developing your economic capital. So in Germany, it quite often gets used as a fighting word against neoliberalism. One person who sums it up really well was a guy called Hans Gadamer, who was a German philosopher, and he said it's openness to otherness. So it's being that open-minded individual who's constantly looking for learning experiences to form as a person. I saw that the philosophy got put my way by a supervisor at Sunderland University who said, read a bit about this, you might like it. But what I find particularly attractive about it as a philosophy is that it's about becoming a person rather than some kind of functional machine, which is like, and a theme through this talk is that I feel that if you're working class, lots of your opportunities in education are about making you functional for a purpose. And the great thing about Bildung is that it's completely individual. You decide what you learn, you control it, and it stays with you throughout your life course. So some people might now be thinking, okay, so what does this look like in reality? And in this country, I can't really say. But if I move on to my next slide, which is this rather, if people remember the Smurfs, people quite often say it looks a bit like Father Abraham from the Smurfs. Grundtvig was a Danish educator, philosopher, poet, who saw in his own country, Denmark, that the people who governed the country mostly spoke Latin and Swedish, were mostly detached from the rest of the population. It was a country without any big identity. It was threatened by Germany. And he thought the folk of the country, which was a largely rural country at that point, should be the people who ran the country. So he decided what he wanted to do was not start a revolution, but set up a series of schools called the folk high schools, with the thinking that if you don't educate people to be democratic agents, then it's never going to happen. You need to prepare those people for government. But what he really hated above anything else was education that, I think he called it the education for death or dark education, which was all about learning Latin and things that were detached from day-to-day life. So he had certain principles that he wanted to put into it. One was that he wanted people to mostly learn through talking. So there was no exams at all. And there's like a famous phrase that he used, which was first comes the life before the light. And what he wanted to do was infuse people through great ideas in education, through philosophy, through history, through whatever, to try and light a spark. But he thought that if you did that through rigorous qualifications, and those typical kind of regimes that we're all used to, that killed people's love of learning. So he wanted to light up people's lives and create something which is like a real common theme in Denmark now called wonderstanding. It was to get people wondering about life and the world. So it was almost like an educational revolution in the country. To give you an idea of how influential this popular education was, I'm sure that there's some people out there, or many people out there, have heard of the Highlander Folk School or the Highlander School in America, which was so prominent in the civil rights movement. Well, the guy who set up that school, Miles Horton, went to the Danish folk high schools and got lots of his inspiration from what they were doing. So that's a little bit about how you can take Bildung and you can put it into schools. If I move on, and then I'll finish up on the history bit. I live in Newcastle, and about twice a week I drive past this place called the People's Theatre. And the People's Theatre was set up in 1914 by the local Socialist Party. And their view was really simple, that working people needed access to all of the people who were middle class and higher if they were ever going to elevate themselves above the working conditions that they were in. So all across the country, all kinds of like clubs and activities were set up by Socialist Party members, and one of them was the People's Theatre, because they recognised that if people needed building. So, and I still find this now, lots of people that I teach would never go to the theatre. So they set up their own theatres so that people felt more comfortable in going. And they set up, other things like reading groups around working class people, which lots of people will be familiar with from sorry, that's gone out of my brain. I'll just take a pause there. So there was a big movement on this, and as part of my research, what I've done is I've looked at different points over the last 100 years where this was the case, where there was a genuine move to give working people access to a whole range of different learning experiences. And what I found is mostly they're very short-lived because we get told that there isn't enough money for them. And I think that a quote from recent times pretty much sums it up, from Alan Johnson in 2006, when he famously said, Tai Chi may be hugely valuable to the people studying it, but it's of little value to the economy. So still today, and this is something that I see a lot, that we have language classes which are full of middle class people, and we have functional skills classes that are full of working class and unemployed people. But there has been there is a constant theme in British history in adult education that tries to break that down. And every time numbers go up of working class learners and the money gets pulled, and then things go back to normal again, which is a pet hate of mine. So I've tried to go through three things so that people know what building is, know that it is possible because they did it in Denmark. And also there's a strong socialist theme around trying to buck the trend in adult education, which is about always seeming to fund making people functional and preparing them for the labour market to do all of those low-level kind of jobs. So among many things that I've done in education, I've taught English in the community. And one place that I absolutely loved teaching was Biker. And I got given the job working there basically because nobody else wanted it. Because I still find today, and at the risk of offending people, that there are a lot of people in education who are kind of middle class people who want to help the poor people unless the job is too hard, and then they don't want to go to places like Biker, even though it's a very nice place to go to. Because something that I hear far too frequently, when I taught in schools, people used to talk about the right kind of family. And now I'm in adult education, people quite often talk about the right kind of learner. I don't really know what the right kind of learner is, but the learners in Biker are generally considered not to be. But it's where I had one of my best ever teaching experiences. So I had to teach them functional skills English. I'd never done this before because I was used to teaching English in schools. So significantly, they were all women. There's a group of about 12. And I think, there's probably lots of research on why these courses in the community attract largely working class women. But what I would say is that I went in with this idea that I might behave myself, which is not something that I normally do. So I went in to teach them the normal functional skills rubbish, which might be writing a letter of complaint to the local electricity board or something like that, and had a really boring day. So I lasted a short while, and then I thought, I can't do this. I need to get stuck in with what they actually need and what they want. Which is what we did. And that was a huge turning point in the relationship with these learners, because they came in, they were a typical group of, they were loud. They wanted to go for a break every 2 minutes. They wanted to test me. So my whole approach with them was one of no rules, because I grew up in a family with no rules. And what I was told before I went was, you don't let them swear, don't let them smoke, don't let them eat, which was quite surprising. So what I did was I flipped there was two things that I did with them. One is that I flipped all of that on their head, because I don't actually care. If they want to go for a cigarette, they just go for one. If they want to eat at the table, it doesn't make any difference to me. And by actually imposing no rules at all, they just made up their own rules, which was great. And then I asked them what they were there to do, which is something that I don't think happens enough. And they were there because they wanted to write stories, they wanted to read books together, they wanted to write poems. They were also kind of quite straightforward about the fact that they could leave their children in the creche, and they got a bit of time to be with each other. But the biggest thing is that all of them admitted that they'd actually been really scared to turn up in the first place. So I wasn't about to teach them how to write what I would consider quite useless functional bits of writing when they'd actually been brave enough to walk in the door. So I'll move on from the setting in Biker. So we did a range of activities which were all just about them and life and issues. So I'm not going to go through all three of these, because to tell you the truth, I don't think I've got time. But there was one story that we took time to read, and I haven't got any evidence from this at all. So there was nothing written. We basically read a story together called Lamb to the Slaughter, and I knew that they would love it. The story was about a woman who was being abused by her husband, who was a police officer. So she murdered him and cooked him and fed him to his colleagues and got away with it, which you can imagine created a fabulous discussion and resonated with all of them. But the key thing from it was that at the end of that session, two of them came up to me and said, "Can I have a copy of this story, because I want to show it to my friend?" So there was, that activity, it didn't achieve a qualification. It definitely wasn't functional. But the story kind of went out there and it got them talking. We did lots and lots of things like that, and that's what we kept on doing. And the end result of it was that besides generally being, that they would say that they were happier, I would say that they were definitely calmer as well. They all began to see themselves differently. They began to see themselves as learners, and that they all kind of went on to do other things. One got a job working for a voluntary organisation. Another one wanted to take their own experiences and start on a counselling course. But anyway, it was a very special time with them. But the whole point was that it was very built on kind of activity, because it was based on their interests, what they wanted to do, and they developed as people, and I developed as a person as well, because I've been teaching for nearly 30 years, and I can remember every single one of them, the activities we did, and how I grew as well as them. So just finishing up with a couple of things on that, was that Alan Tuckett, which is a phrase which definitely needs bringing back, wrote a piece a couple of years ago called "Seriously Useless Learning." If I was to, now the reason why I did all of this is because I know full well that when you teach in the community, nobody takes any notice of what you're doing anyway most of the time. So I could do whatever I chose to without being particularly worried. But Alan Tuckett calls it seriously useless learning. It doesn't reach qualification. It doesn't necessarily get a job, but it's dead serious learning. If I just move on to my final slide, just to give you an idea of where I'm going. So there are educators globally who buy into this philosophy, and I'm trying to spread it. And if you would like to know more about the philosophy of Bildung, then there is a manifesto being written. Well, it's a manifesto. It's not every day you get to sign a manifesto. But if you read it, you'll be surprised, because you will think, yeah, I agree with that. That's how I would like the world to be. So on my final slide, kind of bunged on. I've written up this as a story. It appears on Adult Conversations, thanks to Joe and various people who put that together. And also, if you want to sign the manifesto, give it a go. And I think that's nearly 20 minutes, and I think that's me.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. We've had a crash course there in Bildung. I wanted to just kick off the questions. We have had a few things come in the chat. And I just wanted to ask, first one is from Richard, actually, our panelist. He asks, would it be correct to say that Bildung is pretty much the opposite of Tory educational policy in the UK? So perhaps something of a leading question. What do you think of that?
Oh, I think that it's most definitely a socialist philosophy on teaching, because it's about not. Mind you, in saying that, I say it's opposite of the Tory administration. I don't actually think that Blair's administration was a lot better. I think that it's the opposite of neoliberalism, is what it is.
Yeah. If I may just use chair's privilege quickly. On one of your penultimate slide, you mentioned the word praxis, like with an X. I know that term can mean a lot of things to, can mean different things to different people. And some of the things you said in your talk really resonated with me, because they really reminded me of some things that Paulo Freire says about how the learners can teach the teacher as well as vice versa. And I just wanted to, I know he wrote about praxis. I just wanted to ask if you really quickly give us a quick definition of what that means to you, what praxis means to you.
Yeah, to me, praxis is actually the activities that you do in teaching. Yeah. So if I was to start a new class by saying to the learners, what is it that you want to learn? To me, that would be a praxis. Yeah. So to me, praxis is a doing word. It's the application of an idea.
Cool. Okay, thank you. All right, so thank you very much, Gary. I'm going to remove your spotlight, and yeah, I know you can't hear us, but I'm sure there's virtual applause from the group. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Julie Devon. Julie is going to present to us about her experience, titled Space to Grow, sense of being, place and purpose, learning to feel well, a person-centered resource, and becoming an expert in yourself. So, Julie, I can see your slide sharing correctly now.
Okay.
So I think it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name's Julie Devon. I'm a current PhD researcher at Teesside University. This presentation will share my academic journey and experience so far. So my academic life so far, after starting a degree over 25 years ago, I came back to study in 2010 when I completed my adult numeracy, so maths GCSE, as it was unfinished business to me. It was something that was niggling away that I hadn't achieved at school, and I wanted to get it done. So after a lot of sort of CPD and things like that, lots of community courses, volunteering and that kind of thing, I'd sort of caught the bug for studying at that point. I then took on a teaching qualification, so Cert Ed, in 2017, and during that course, my tutor, so I'd sort of told her about my background of I'd done this course, I'd done that. It was bits of this, bits of a degree, bits of open university study and credits and that kind of thing. And she described my educational journey as an unravelled an unravelled plait. Freudian slip there. So like an unravelled plait. So my education was a bit of this, bit of that. It was all over the place. So it was nice to sort of, there's a bit of a momentum to sort of me to start to plait that together, to make it sort of pull together. As you can see from the slide, I then went on to do a BA Honours degree in education with community engagement, and then straight onto an MA degree in design. And then I'm currently a PhD researcher. Just to go back to the BA degree, I came in at year 3 with that. So I didn't go through the full sort of 3 years of the programme. I came in at year 3, bringing all of those credits from other academic study and making up enough credits to get onto the course. So it was a bit of a hodgepodge of starting off, but it got me to where I needed to be, kind of thing. So what I aim to cover today is space to grow, person-centered approaches, creativity, authentic voice, learning to feel well, and being an expert in yourself. I would like to inspire you to find your space to grow through your own personal and academic experiences. So setting the scene. In 2019, I took part in a research project with Teesside University with my current, with my Director of Studies, and who was about to be my Director of Studies for my PhD. So I took part in her research project. So this was my first visit to the campus, and the first thing I noticed, they had lovely trees. That was a beautiful little thing for me. I thought I sort of started to imagine what it would be like to be there as a student. I sort of thought, how does this environment look and feel to me? And the trees were a big selling point for me, because I thought I can sort of grow and change with the trees if I was on campus. So I was sold when I saw those trees. Next came starting my PhD the week that the pandemic broke out. So I had applied for my PhD, requiring support with the proposal due to my dyslexia. Once accepted, I started to prepare for what I thought I'd look like as a PhD researcher. So I'd put together a bit of a toolkit in this photo here. I had sort of a little lunch bag, had some pamper products, so I had some nice new hand cream, some face masks, things like that, lots of post-it notes. I had some new clothes. I'd bought a dictaphone because I thought I was going to be doing sort of face-to-face interviews with people and things like that. I bought a lot of odds and ends of tech. So I put together this toolkit of what I thought I would look like starting as a PhD candidate. So when I started the PhD in March, this is how I hoped it would be. So I had this very inspirational PhD proposal, and the title, which I've used today as well, that was primarily based on my MA. So it was inspired through my journey from my MA and my BA. It was to sort of think, I want to empower people to sort of work with nature and creativity to benefit their well-being. And I wanted them to be sort of really inspired. So I was quite upbeat and that kind of thing about it. That was how I hoped 2020 was going to be. I literally started my PhD initial sort of mandatory training. I had one session on campus, and it was the week that lockdown sort of kicked in, so that came to a halt pretty quick. This is a picture here of my workstation. So as I'd enrolled as a full-time PhD researcher because I was told that I would have a workspace, and this was important to me. I was sort of, yippee, I was over the moon that I'd have a little office area I could set up, and this is where, in my mind, I was going to be focused, I was going to study, and I was going to grow as well. This was a big thing for me, to have the right environment. So previously, during my BA and MA, I had realised that the study environment was important to me. I needed literally a space to grow. And just to note, I didn't see this PhD space that's in the photo anymore after this picture was taken. That was kind of it. This is what studying creativity looked like for me in 2020. And these are things that worked. So during 2020, initially, I was super busy and motivated. I was creative, growing vegetables and plants, spending lots of time with my pets and enjoying photography. I was also doing some freelance online tutor work. And these kind of things sort of kept me ticking along. I was sort of very much in the momentum of how social media and things at the time were sort of saying, oh, try creativity, try this, try that. And I was thinking, yes, this is my thing. Having just finished an MA in design, I thought, this is my forte. This is my stuff. You know what I mean? I was straight into it. But a bit further down the line, as 2020 went on Twitter and things like that. So Twitter's the only social media I use. I started to hear people saying, how do they expect us to be creative? How do they expect us to be doing all of this stuff? All of the people with sourdough starters making the breads, and which I did. I tried it. It was a nightmare. It didn't work. I tried all of those things because I was kind of as if I was joining in or something. I was joining into something and that kind of thing. But I was hearing from people, they didn't want that push. People were burnt out, basically. They didn't want all of this shoving in their face. And it gradually, with myself, put a halt on my own creativity. I suddenly stopped being interested in using creativity as a resource for my own well-being. And that started to have a strange effect on me. I was kind of thinking, but this has always worked for me, but suddenly it wasn't working. People were just simply surviving with no space for personal growth, or so I felt. This made me then, I wanted to sort of change my PhD title and the whole essence of it. I felt that I couldn't try and sell positivity when things were so bad. So I decided sort of late last year, early this year, to pause my studies. I decided after a full year in 2020 of pretty much doing any and every webinar I could get my hands on, because I felt like I should be studying. I'd embarked on a PhD kind of thing. I decided to start saying no to things and to set some personal boundaries. I realised I was overcommitted to things and just trying to look busy to myself. Nobody was forcing me to do this, and I became really quite overwhelmed. I then came back to sort of, after this period of change sort of starting to happen, I came back to reflective practice. So I had covered reflective practice in my BA and within my MA as well. And I needed to sort of recap on what my needs were. I've got a quote here from Bolton. So intellectual space and property, space and opportunity, physical space from work and social group, psychological space to rethink my responses, reactions, motivations, expectations and hopes. And within the book, this is from sort of a journal entry of a case study. So somebody was working through a personal journal using reflective practice. And this was their sort of escape to just have some time to themselves. And it's this sort of reflective practice that I found I keep coming back to as a resource. So after 2020, attending many webinars and keeping busy, I engaged in the Working Class Academics Conference. I didn't watch all of them because I found it quite a lot to sort of take in, but I dipped in and out of the days kind of thing. But what I did watch helped me feel included, represented, empowered and motivated. But alongside sort of I've sort of the words working classness, and I discussed this with Andrew the other day, and I thought, I don't know if that's even a real phrase, you know, but I thought I was starting to think prior to this conference, what is my working classness? And some of a lot as an academic, I'd sort of came across the feeling of an imposter phenomena, sort of thinking, how on earth have I gotten this far? Why should I be doing this kind of thing? I suddenly started to feel a lack of motivation, and there was a lot of procrastination and self-frustration. And I've got a little quote there, which sort of I looked at this quote last night and I sort of thought, well, you can sometimes get stuck on being stuck. And are you putting these blocks in front of you because you don't think you're sort of worthy in a way to be doing what you're doing? So you kind of subconsciously might put these blocks in front of yourself. I want to turn that round on the next slide there. So working classness and positive opportunity. So not overcoming, but working with my personal barriers. I use my working classness as a return to positive opportunity. Prior to today's conference, I asked myself, am I working class enough? In my head, I met my imagined criteria of, I came from a mining family, I live in a council house, I'm on a low income and I've had struggle. So I sort of thought, well, in theory, I sort of fit the criteria, but I was still questioning my working classness. One of the things as well, I've sort of used study as self-care over the years. So prior to my 2010 sort of re-embarking on study with my GCSE maths, prior to that, in 2008, I'd lost my mum and my brother. They'd both passed away. So I was kind of in this limbo of what does life look like now? What is it? And once I started studying and volunteering, it got me on a track. So I kind of then felt that study was a bit of a form of self-care for me. It was supporting, helping my grief. It was sort of supporting my mental health. And as a recently diagnosed autistic person, unbeknown to me at the time, it's been supporting my neurodiversity. I sort of thought as well, would it make a difference if I tried harder? And I also thought a working classness, the way that feels to me is personal drive. Nobody sort of encouraged me per se to sort of go on this academic path, but I've had a personal drive within me to sort of escalate. And I've got a quote here from Joy White from her book Terraformed. We offered an uncompromising narrative about what it means to grow up poor with limited choices. loss features strongly, but so does love. And I thought that felt quite fitting to how I felt about my working classness in this moment. So looking forward, as a person-centred approach, using my academic experience as a guide, I now saw I had the chance, the confidence and ability to change my study route and make it work for me. So as from 2022, I should be restarting my PhD, but I'll be doing it part-time. And I've decided that I don't need to rush it, because previously I thought I had to be full-time, I had to get it done. I was on this track of study after my MA, but 2020 and 21 have made me think, no, there's no rush. I can take a bit of a slow down pace with it. So the next steps, studying with my PhD. I've paused my study for a year, and that's to benefit my health. I'm potentially moving to a change of school, so I might move to a creative school instead of, I'm currently in health and social sciences under the psychology. I'll also look to change my PhD to be practice-led, because I feel I'll be coming back to sort of creativity, which works best for me. Through this, I found an authentic voice. I realised I had been seeking my authentic voice and was now going to use it. Without sounding twee, I think my actual space to grow is inside me, not a separate place. And I always seem to have had that sort of frustration of living in a council house, of thinking, oh, I'd like a bigger house, I'd like a bit more space, I'd like an office space, I'd like a spare room to be able to do all of this study and creativity and everything. But the reality is, all of the work that I've done so far has just been in this little 2-bedroom council house. That's where all the creativity's happened. It hasn't happened in a big fancy house anywhere. So looking now at my PhD so far, I love this sort of little image that I've used here. So I've sort of so far, which I'm sure a lot of other students have felt in this circumstance, I felt overwhelmed, overcommitted and in constant fight or flight. I've also sort of been working through and processing my own disability, so dyslexia, fibromyalgia and autism. But at the end of the day, as this little picture demonstrates, I go on one end, the PhD happens, and I love the idea of being Dr. Me. That really pleases me. And my study buddy, as it were, through the PhD process and to get this presentation together today, my study buddy's been anxiety. That's been my fuel sort of the past month to sort of put this together. Thinking I can't do it, so the self-doubt kicked in, the imposter phenomenon, things like that kicked in. I can't do it, I can't, why should I be attending and doing the conference? But I've done it anyway. I've managed to put something together. So looking back, what have I covered today? As a parent, one of the things I thought of is why I study. So as a parent, I'd like to inspire my kids and feel I feel I have to work harder, maybe eventually, to provide a decent life for them and me in the future. So that's one of the reasons I sort of keep studying, with the hope of potentially getting to that sort of lecturer or professor level, potentially, even though my sort of work background was in community mental health and creative arts and that kind of thing as a tutor and creative practitioner. But I would sort of like to use that person-centered approach to go into academia. So just to sort of recap, over my presentation, we have looked at space to grow. We've looked at person-centered approaches. We've discussed creativity, authentic voice, learning to feel well, and becoming an expert in yourself. I hope I have inspired you to find your space to grow through your own personal and academic experiences. And that's the end of my slides. I'd just like to say thank you for listening, as Fraser Crane says. Thank you to Andrew and Alex, because I've been a bit of a nightmare in catching up with stuff and keeping on track with things. My email's there if anybody wanted to contact me. And I also have a bibliography at the end if anybody wanted to refer to some of the work. So that's me done.
Julie, thank you so much. That's such a powerful story. We do have time. We're going to have one question because Kevin's asked it in the Q&A. But I think looking back on the chat, so much of what you said has resonated with so many of our attendees. So thank you very much. And absolutely not a nightmare, an absolute delight to work with. Kevin asked about looking after yourself. So he says, how would you describe how a PhD student should look? Is it open to preconceived ideas and prejudice? And have others attempted to describe how you as a PhD student should look?
No, that this is coming back to the last sort of comment. There's nobody else structuring how I do this. I've got no one aside from my kids, obviously. They're a big influence on how and why I do things and how it looks to me, because I sort of reflect a lot back to them and get their opinion. But there's nobody sort of saying to me, this is how I think you should do it, this is how I think you should look. It's just my own personal thing. Sorry, what was the beginning of the other question there? Sorry.
Yeah, it was just the question about, so how would you describe how a PhD student should look, and is it open to preconceived ideas and prejudice? And Kevin's also asked if have others attempted to describe how you should look.
I think maybe being sort of the age I am currently, I don't really care. I don't really care what other people think about how I look or dress, and so how the physical thing of how I might look as a PhD is only to do with me, and that feels lovely. It's nice to be of that age where I can sort of think I'm not bothered about that sort of stuff anymore. It's just not important. I'm really enjoying the path I'm on, and I thrive on learning. I find it hard. I struggle. I get super anxious. As an autistic person, I'm rerouting how I process things all the time. But once I do it, I love it, and it makes me really passionate about things.
Well, thank you very much, Julie. Again, what an amazing story. Okay. Richard Hudson-Miles is going to speak to us for the next 20 minutes or so with notes on the class character of the art school. So Richard, I believe you have slides you want to screen share. And yep, I can now see that.
Is that working fine?
Yeah, I can now see PowerPoint there. So if you want to go ahead when you're ready, I will hand over.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So this is a sketch of a kind of longer project I'm working on, which attempts to think through the ideologies of the art school and art education and shape its class character, primarily through a French philosopher called Jacques Rancière. I'm aware that this title sounds a wee bit Leninist. It's not meant as such. If anything, it's a bit ironic, because what I'm interested in increasingly is the critique of class critique. I don't mean the rejection of class critique, but I'm sort of skeptical, certainly in terms of art, about the reduction of art to questions of class. And Rancière in particular shows how particularly like reductive, doctrinaire class critique can stifle or limit the progressive or emancipatory or political potential of art. The key example, of course, of this is the cultural censorship of the Zhdanovite period in the Soviet Union. But the title is also here as a kind of an acknowledgement of a personal I don't know, ontological inheritance, or maybe a political indeterminacy of my own, you know. And I'm aware that, you know, we're living in the age of a neoliberal onslaught, a commodification, marketization, financialization of higher education, which just entrenches barriers to HE, entrenches inequalities, stops people getting access to the university. So I don't by any means want to downplay questions of class. In raising these questions, I also want to just try and weave in some autobiographical reflections about my journey through university, which I hope fits with the vibes of the conference and no one finds awfully self-indulgent. So like a lot of other speakers that I've heard today, I was first generation HE. I come from Huddersfield. If you don't know, it's a town which was recently voted the worst place to live in the UK, which I regard as absolutely bewildering, grotesquely unfair, and most likely a symptom of class prejudice, the ingrained class prejudice in this country. So for me, Huddersfield is a town steeped in romantic class action. It's a centre for Chartism, Owenism, the Luddites, the suffragettes. Its topography is punctuated by these dark satanic mills of the heavy woolen industry, detailed in Marxist Capital, and in this painting by Lowry. Now, I've always hated Lowry's paintings. I find them dismal and grey, and these representations of downtrodden northern workers meekly trudging between the factory and their homes just depress me. They seem to, I don't know, constitute a self-fulfilling prophecy, just like what Engels called mere life, a limit that the working class can aspire to no more than this. Weirdly though, of course, these paintings are really popular with the working classes, largely I believe because there are very few paintings or artworks that actually represent working class existence, however flawed that might be, you know. For example, I couldn't name another famous painting of Huddersfield. The blaxploitation films of the 1970s were popular with the black kind of underclasses as well for the same reasons, despite them being obviously racist. Anyway, my father was an industrial factory worker, and my mum was an NHS nurse. Neither was particularly militant or particularly political. Neither had understanding about universities, or even less about my chosen specialism in the arts. I guess from their position, though, they would absolutely never have said anything of the sort. The choice of an arts degree must have seemed totally irresponsible, self-indulgent, and a wasted opportunity to achieve some sort of social mobility. From my current status as a precariously employed postdoc, certainly the financial rewards of academia have been scant, and the choice of an academic career, especially within the neoliberal university, distinctly is questionable. I've reached my current status, my precarious existence, with pretty much zero guidance or support, certainly no financial support other than an endless string of grant applications and rejection letters. And I've spat bitter class venom at Oxbridge students who seem to just breeze into these glamorous academic positions while I have to justify working as an FE lecturer here and there, as a break from research to funding committees, you know. So I've built this ad hoc and non-traditional path. That's nothing against FE, but in some kind of research universities, it is weird. They say, you know, that's a failing that you became a teacher for a bit. You're not serious about research. So as a first generation HE student, I'm acutely aware of what Professor Bruce McFarlane's recently called Gilroot students, sorry, with their accrued socio-cultural academic capital. Sorry, I've got a message up there. Their kind of academic learned savoir-vivre. As a working class art student specifically, I felt like like a class traitor, but then paradoxically like someone who'd escaped the constraints of my class, even if that escape financially has been a little bit illusory. At some point, I can't identify why it was accidental. During my first years at university, my Yorkshire accent disappeared or diluted at least. When I returned back to Huddersfield over the summer, my mates would take the piss out of me for being affected, for my affectations. Probably, unlike what Julie said, and it's fine, but it's one of the reasons I rarely use my doctoral title. In fact, only when the bank are calling in an overdraft do I use doctor. So I tend to kind of shy away from people who boast doctor on their Twitter handles. And certainly I feel a bit embarrassed at the blank looks I get when I try and explain why I justify the title of a doctor to my non-academic friends. I've been to Cuba where doctors are cultural heroes. I don't feel like a particular hero anyway. But then if you know the work of Mark Fisher, the blogger K-Punk, he recently spoke about similarly repressing his East Midlands accent after being accused of having speech and accent problems by a snobbish colleague. But when he's reviewing the Sleaford Mod's latest, well, the Divide and Exit LP, it's really guttural, fiercely East Midlands. He suggests that working class accents can be proudly weaponized, quote, as a challenge to the machineries of class subordination, a refusal to be marked as inferior. That's amazing, but sadly my accent's disappeared into a sort of neutral academese, which I don't know, the Sleaford Mods might find as a political capitulation, but without wanting to sound too deconstructive, weaponizing a class identity can never really escape the police order, social order recuperation of that identity, which will recast it or reframe it as a limit again, So what if you want to be viewed as something other than the working class, or you want to speak in your voice rather than ventriloquizing, if that's a word, the embittered working class, to speak rather than be spoken for or without prejudice. Certainly there are tropes about working class behaviors, particularly on the militant circles, that I don't want to be associated with at all. Machismo, a firebrand speech is the authoritarian discipline of Socialist Party cadres. So I don't recognise myself in the Labour Party, the SWP, the CPGB, or any other sect, and I wouldn't want to be a member of any of them, especially if it meant following a preordained way of interpreting the world, class-based or otherwise. So I guess what I'm saying is, I want to be a radical art historian, but not necessarily a working class art historian, if that is a label. So it's here that I should just quickly acknowledge the influence of Rancière in all of this. This is just one of his books. It's a brilliant book, an anti-disciplinary book about manual labourers in 19th century France working. It's all based on their diaries. Working at the time when Marx and Engels were writing the Communist Manifesto. So out of these diaries, Rancière kind of finds that their class identities are conflicted, right? So instead of this kind of glorious image of the communist worker, right, who takes pride in the honesty of their toil, right, these workers hated their factories, they hated their lives, they resented the proletarian condition, they envied the free time of the bourgeois classes, and what they wanted to do was use the time in between shifts at night or whatever to ape bourgeois culture, which they thought would emancipate them. So they wanted to be poets and painters, not floor layers. Anyway, I've no doubt that what I work on a particularly militant brand of educational critique now, which I'm absolutely sure is some sort of form of compensation without putting me on the psychoanalyst couch for the class betrayal I enacted at some point when studying fine art all those years ago. Rancière's teacher, Louis Althusser, used to justify his position at the Sorbonne as a superstar professor by arguing that it's okay, philosophy is the class struggle in theory, right? The class struggle in philosophy. So in this analysis, the university educator is equally as important as the militant who organizes at the factory gates. And in fact, they're the real key to stop the university degenerating into an ideological state apparatus, as he called it. The problem with this analysis, of course, is that tenured professors, and I speak as a member of the University Precariat, actually embody the ruling class, or at least they could be argued to embody the ruling class of the university. Beneath the tenured professors are what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have called the maroon community of the university, which is constituted of, quote, composition teachers, mentalist grad students, adjunct Marxist historians, out or queer management professors, state college ethnic studies departments, closed down film programs, visa expired Yemeni student newspapers, historically black college sociologists, feminist engineers. You could extend this list indefinitely. How do these maroons problematize the university, Harney and Moten ask? What I want to point out is the intersectionality and heterogeneity of this list problematizes any collective understanding of a university working class. You know, if there is the possibility of a class struggle in the university, it must emerge from a recognition of a difference which exceeds kind of coherent notions of class. So just like Lowry, my first degree was in painting at Manchester School of Art, what now calls itself Manchester School of Art. But when I went, it was Manchester Met, and before then Manchester Poly, and then before then the Manchester School of Design. The schools of design were established in the 1830s in most provincial UK towns, and then they were incorporated in the polytechnics in the 60s and then rebranded as universities in 92. I'm sure you all know this. But the schools of design, rather than the romantic image which you might associate, I don't know, with art school since the 60s, schools of design were pretty dismal places. They were primarily designed to equip a productive class with the skills necessary to man the production lines for the export markets, textile mainly. And evidence suggests that they were pretty unsuccessful at producing artists, mainly just art teachers, I guess, like me. Manchester School of Art, calling itself that now, it's interesting to me that they revert to this 19th century identity, not least because their self-identified mission now is to equip students with the employability skills to man the kind of positions that are largely non-existent within a kind of fictional creative industry. So there's a weird reversal, but certainly the dismal historical reality of the schools of design is very different from the emancipatory future promised by university marketing publicity, you know, at the moment. But also, since their polytechnicization, art schools have a weird fit within universities because they're essentially artisanal, devoted to technical and haptic knowledges, and their outputs are difficult to fit within the limited schema of traditional research audits. Arts papers receive less citations and are therefore significantly lower on the H index than other disciplines. Arts research grants are paltry in comparison to STEM subjects. And then if we talk about graduate earnings, these are recent Exchequer figures. They not only show a marked gap between the career projected incomes, this is over a 50-year life cycle, of art graduates who end up costing the country money over the long run as comparison to medicine and dentistry. Based on that's based on the extremely high rate of student loan defaults. But basically, this is why you get rhetoric around the arts being low value, poor value for money, and why you get proposals to contemplate denying art students the access to the loan book, which would be the only way many students could actually study the arts, or making them cut the costs of the tuition past the maroon community. And based on these stats, it's difficult to even argue that art schools proletarianize their students. It's something more dismal than that, you know, something more bleak. Anyway, this is my last image. So to bring this to an end of sorts, I hope I haven't been moving too fast. This is a painting of Oxford Road in Manchester by the painter Adolphe Valette. He's a French impressionist who taught at Manchester School of Art. and was famous for teaching Lowry. So I stand to both of these in some sort of like inheritance, I guess, if that doesn't sound too pretentious. Manchester School of Art is on the other side of this railway bridge, which still exists. A reverse angle, and the original site of the Peterloo massacre. So I chose Manchester primarily because of this kind of socialist tradition, but also because of a romantic identification with the music scene of the city, especially the Smiths. And one of my favorite books then, which was Engels' Conditions of the Working Class. So all of which spoke to me about working class immiseration in various different ways. As a student, I used to try and retrace the steps of Engels through the map on the inside. Ancoats and Lower Cheetham Hill. For Engels, these were streets of cholera, poverty, pollution, and what he called the social murder of the capitalist class. Social murder enacted by the capitalist class. They're now car parks. This isn't, but offices and city centre loop roads. Recently, I heard that some entrepreneur had marketized these psychogeographic derives that I used to go on as an element of a guided Marx and Engels walking tour. One thing I always used to be interested in, maybe disgusted about these kind of paintings by Villette, was that he could aestheticize the Manchester streets, of whose deprivation Engels wrote about so powerfully and bitterly. The discipline I eventually trained in was called the social history of art, which was, you're supposed to take the kind of aestheticization and undercut it by bringing it back to the reality of the forces and relations of production within which art is made. You're supposed to dispel ideology, and it's produced some of the best art history. I'm not dissing the social history of art, but there's a cruder version of that kind of art history, whose high point was in the Stalinist period, which bifurcates the world into bourgeois and proletarian, the illusion and science or theory or sociology or whatever. The former is like an aesthetic denial of social reality, and the latter kind of dispels those phantoms, right, with theory. The consequence of that under the Stalinist period was that all art, apart from that followed the party line of the Comintern, was banned, and you could just make simple images of kind of communist political messages, right? Factories, muscled workers, rallies, you know, stuff like that. So my concern has always been like how to be working class and an art historian without being a working class art historian in the cruder sense, or a working class art historian who hates art, you know. Rancière's work in this sense shows how I think art can be political beyond just conveying a political message, a simple political message. So when grimy streets receive the same aesthetic attention given to portraits of kings and queens, when railway bridges shimmer like sunlight on Giverny lily ponds, or when obvious narrative structure is jettisoned in favour of an open meaning which can be completed by the viewer, this represents a challenge to the expected order of things. The politics of aesthetics is the suggestion that the sensible order, the established order in general, can be overturned. And this is a challenge that goes beyond the genre codes of art history, right? It's the essence of the political. In this sense, a worker demonstrating they can be a worker demonstrating that they can be a poet is more political than a poem about the October Revolution, to use Lisa's term this morning. It's the politics of choice between a poetic voice or an animalistic voice of a worker's grunt. The buildings underneath the railway bridge in Villette's paintings are now either bars, kebab shops, or mobile phone stores. I was coming out of one when I was crossing the road drunkenly after a binge drinking session, a behaviour I learned from my working class upbringing. I got run over by a taxi, a newer version of a taxi than one of those. and smashed both my shoulder and its windows as it flipped me over its roof. Places are always more than an economic index of poverty and inequality. They are narrated and constructed spaces which are perpetually being written and rewritten through lived experience. For me, Oxford Road, Manchester is written in the smell of turts, the socialism of Marx and Engels, the splintering of bone, student debt, and the baggage of provincial small-town life. Engels tells us, quote, "A knowledge of proletarian conditions is absolutely necessary to be able to provide solid ground for socialist theory and to put an end to all sentimental dreams and fancies," end quote. I didn't author this title, but my fine art degree show 20 years ago was entitled "What Dreams and Debts Are Made Of." That's it. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much, Richard. There's so much there, isn't there? There is, I think, as Alex Dunedin said in the chat, blistering analyses. Apologies, your video has just been freezing and audio's been just stuttering a little bit. So you may want to turn your camera off at this point. Thank you. Really positive comments coming through in the chat. I'm just conscious of time, everyone. So there weren't actually any direct questions this time, although lots of appreciative comments and chat going on. I want to hand over now to Ben Hickman to talk about the Labour Humanities. Oh, there we go.
I don't have a PowerPoint, Andrew, so it's just,
okay. Absolutely, no problem. My apologies, I'd forgotten. Okay, so over to you if you want to begin your piece. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Yes, just going to be my face, I'm afraid. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk here about sort of the opposite of what the title suggests, since I'm going to try and describe how Labour has been excluded and excised from the humanities, and really why there is no Labour humanities. In a way, there are things like the animal humanities and medical humanities, such things. And I suppose, I mean, just as an observation, even this working class conference, and you know, even from people from the social sciences, there's not been much talk about work beyond academic work. And that's not a criticism of anyone. It's just to observe that, you know, even here in a working class conference, we're really talking about work as an identity, working classness as an identity rather than as an activity. And well, as you see, I think the working part of working class is important. So I'm going to describe what I see as the origin of that exclusion, and then go on to its most influential proponent, Hannah Arendt, not least because she's the best example of the politics that emerges from it. And finally, I'll just say how this politics without work that so many academics lay claim to as a radical politics is a aesthetics, really, and not so much a politics. Yeah, so I'm not going to give a biography of myself because that's not really what I'm talking about. So I'll just get straight into it. So the thing that most influences how the humanities particularly talks about Labour now is what we could very loosely call modernism. And modernism had two ways of thinking about work that seem like opposites, but have one important thing in common. So clearly, modernism coincides with the peak of, arguably the peak of the political power of the working class globally. And some modernists felt they wanted a piece of the action. And so there's a key strand of modernist art that insists on the craft nature of art, on art as a form of work, and the artist as a kind of worker and maker. So these would be often quite manly men like Pound and Hemingway and Brancusi and people like that, but also people like Gertrude Stein and even Martin Heidegger and people. So people who insisted on the link between creativity and labour. And there's also at the same time a strand of modernism that draws into question the whole value of work, and that's most obvious in a figure like Marcel Duchamp. So obviously in Felton, that famous urinal that Duchamp has, the point is not to admire the handiwork of the urinal maker that Duchamp employed for the piece. It's to admire the extremely witty gesture Duchamp makes by placing that object in an art gallery. So those two positions seem like opposites, but they come together in that they both disavow the social nature of labor. So Duchamp is really, and other conceptualists like since Duchamp, are really kind of managers who appropriate and distribute the work of others. Whereas your more muscular modernism is mostly interested in work as a craft, as an isolated activity, which is to say not in its decisive aspect as a social relation and a power relation. So in both these versions of modernism, work is really a metaphor, you would say, roughly. So there's a brief interruption to that modernism from about 100 years ago in the 1930s, where you get the proletarian arts, where labor as a content is important. But this is very short-lived, and the beginnings of the Cold War, in the Western world at least, cements this sort of second conceptual modernist anti-labor position particularly. So we begin to get an intellectual backlash against work that's after the war beginning to be theoretically articulated. And these articulations are increasingly the sort of uncritical assumptions of liberal academics today. And the figure we see this in most clearly is Hannah Arendt. So people, if this was in a room, I would ask people if they're familiar with that Hannah Arendt, but since I'm sort of talking into the abyss, I can't do that. But so just describe Arendt briefly. So Arendt's this preeminent global liberal intellectual of the post-war period. But today she's probably, I mean, it's arguable, but probably the most celebrated thinker of the last, within academia anyway, of the last couple of decades. So, for example, there are two Arendt journals running. There's a Hannah Arendt Research Center. There are several conferences every year, and a kind of endless run of monographs and edited collections and so on. And of course, the rise of Trump, Brexit, and other forms of what people call populism has seen her star rise even higher. And that's because she speaks about totalitarianism in the kind of general terms that allow you to call anyone you don't like a fascist. But Arendt's bigger achievement, or certainly what she thought was her bigger achievement, was to articulate a politics that sounds radical at the same time as being expunged of all trace of labour, and therefore, to put it simply, expunged of any trace of any radical content, I would say. And that's what I'll talk about now. So Arendt published The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, and that book is famous for its identity thesis, so this equation of Nazism with communism. And most of this comes in a later appendix to the book called Ideology and Terror, which was born of Arendt's very sketchy reading of Marx, which was in turn born of a kind of recognition she had of that book that it explains Nazi Germany better than it explained the Soviet Union. And her solution to that was to claim that labor itself has inbuilt totalitarian tendencies, or is at least uniquely susceptible to totalitarian takeover, as it were. And she gives two reasons for this. Firstly, that laborers are lonely and atomized, and therefore they're likely to be easily led. And secondly, because laborers have a very limited sense of agency, and therefore have this kind of inherently deterministic and therefore despotic view of history. And obviously the shift in attention for Arendt, it does coincide with the shift in the US. Arendt's a German national, but she's living in the US at this time. It coincides with the shift in the US from World War to Cold War, from Nazis to communists as the enemy. But it's also contemporary with what Arendt and many other mid-century thinkers saw as the rise of what universally got called mass society, which everyone was scared of. And we might call that today, the process of proletarianization, especially of intellectuals. But what exactly Arendt means by labour only becomes clear in her next book, The Human Condition, which is published in 1958. So the human condition is this attempt to set clear boundaries between what she thinks of as three varieties of human activity: labour, work, and action. And the book's structured in that way. And these are also ultimately three classes whose muddling Arendt equates with the mass. So she thought the mass was where all these classes got mixed up, and it was a terrible thing. So Arendt's purpose, as she states it, is to rescue politics from labour, which is anti-political, but has started to kind of feed on labour. And there's this sort of a fear that she has. So this hierarchy of labour, work, and action. The first thing to say is that Arendt clearly makes a distinction between labour and work. So for her, labour is this sort of automatic cycle of production and consumption that leaves no trace of itself in the world and is concerned with only reproducing life. Whereas work is the activity of making things at last, of making a world, and what she calls it, she uses that word, world. So work in Arendt's hierarchy is not political, but it is human, and labour is not. And the phrase she uses, this Latin phrase she uses for the labourer, animal laborans, is indicative of that. But the other claim within that is that work has increasingly, historically, particularly with the Industrial Revolution, has increasingly been absorbed back into labour as it's accelerated, as it were. And the kind of historical conclusion that Arendt comes from is that all we're left with at the moment is labour. And that's grim, according to Arendt, because in the course of reducing everything to labour, we've forgotten this other activity that she calls action, which is, we would broadly say, was a synonym of politics. So labour has this very immediate attachment to the world, to the material world. Labour is concerned with the economic, and the economic for Arendt is the opposite of the political. So Arendt speaks of, and this is a little quotation, she speaks of the incapacity of the animal laborans for distinction and hence for action and speech. And she says that laborers, the activity of laborers bears little resemblance to heroic deeds. And for that reason, she says that it removes thought and agency from politics. And she had a word for the universe that labour and work inhabits, and that was encroaching on politics. And her word for it was the social. She has a very idiosyncratic vocabulary, Arendt. But to describe the social, I mean, there's a very famous example of the social in Arendt's notorious essay on Southern school desegregation called Reflections on Little Rock, which was this place where there was a sort of moment of this conflict. And in that essay, she defends segregation, and she does defend segregation on the grounds that schools are social rather than political phenomena. And so the intervention of the state or political campaigners on that world is improper and in fact illiberal. And you may have heard that argument before, although probably in the 19th century. But Arendt's account of labour is less interesting for what it illuminates about labour and more interesting for its account of labour as darkness. So Arendt is one of the first intellectuals to articulate a fear of labour, a kind of metaphysical fear of labour, as distinct from a fear of the working class or communism or whatever. So the important thing for Arendt is that labour cannot be narrated. And when she writes about labour, for her, it's this sort of sublime obscurity. It's defined constantly by what it is not. And she describes it, and this is a quote, as the other, the dark and hidden side of the public realm. So it's always this kind of via negativa, this sort of inhuman and meaningless abyss. And her one concrete figuration of labour, so where she positions labour, as it were, is in the household, the oikos, which is this kind of stand-in for the economic realm in general, because that's obviously where we get that word economic. And she describes it, and just to give again a few quotes about her description of this space, she describes it as a shadowy interior, a kind of darkness of pain and necessity. But it's not just where labour tends to be, it's where labour should be for Arendt. It's where she says, quote, "We should put the darkness of what needs to be hidden." So Arendt obviously doesn't want to abolish labour. She sees it as, you know, simply a natural phenomenon. She just wants it to know its place. And none of this is the same as, this is not a kind of account of the very real, you know, misery and depredations of labour. Clearly, you know, Marx is, you know, describes this at length in Capital, and agitates for abolition. Arendt is not interested in the experience of labour, and she's much less interested in changing it. So, despite this, you know, there's no other words for it. This reactionary and elitist conception of society, Arendt is thought to be a radical with a liberatory politics. And we're said to find this in what Arendt says will redeem labour, and she uses that word redeem. There's going to be a redemption of labour and work, and that's going to come through this concept of action she has. And that's her most famous concept, really, I suppose. So action is the opposite of labour and work. So unlike work, it's a realm of thought and language and originality. And unlike work, it doesn't concern itself with means and ends, or indeed with making at all. And work for Arendt it's not a thinking activity either. It's an activity of cogitation, as she puts it. It's a kind of a machine thinking. So that's what action isn't. But if we want to ask what action is for Arendt, it's very difficult to say, because the hallmark of this action is that it doesn't have a content, and Arendt is quite insistent on it not having content. It's a very important part of what it is. But we could define it as a process of abstraction, and that abstraction manifests in three ways with action. So first of all, action doesn't insist on specific purposes or planning or anything like that, and that's very important to Arendt, because that's what work does. Secondly, action doesn't direct itself towards any questions of materiality, which is the realm of the economic. So it doesn't concern itself with, say, poverty, for example. And thirdly, the agents of action, so the actors, are abstracted from the world of things. So, you know, on the first point, Arendt argues against and this is a quote, the instrumentalization of action and the degradation of politics into a means for something else. Incredibly strange way of thinking about politics. So action, she says, has no end. And she says that because she sees ends as being what lead to atrocities, because ends require means, usually. And politics is an end in itself. And the second point about it, this kind of anti-materialist abstraction that it has, is obviously connected to that conviction. But that's the claim that Arendt has, that the proper subject of politics is itself. It's specifically not the social, the economic, and so on. And this is why even some of the most modest causes of social justice that are dismissed by Arendt. And then finally, the agents of action are abstracted from the workaday world. So action is premised on freedom from necessity. So actors are necessarily a sort of patrician group that just happen to have the civic virtue, the kind of inspiration to act, and she says, the consent of others to act on their behalf. So action moves in this kind of clear, pure air of deliberation. It enjoys itself. It kind of has this sort of jouissance. The mere action of action is good, is a good. And that's why Arendt's model for, you know, the closest we get to her kind of vision of utopia is this very idealized version of ancient Athens, where clearly labor and action are very distinguished, because labor is confined to the household, women slaves, and action has its own space, unsullied by that, the demos of free men. So the appeal of all this is especially to liberal humanities academics is that it's an aesthetics disguised as a politics. Yeah, I'm just finishing up. And art, on Arendt's account, is actions one representative on earth. It's spontaneous, it's not useful, it doesn't have means end rationality, and the artist is at once set apart from his peers and uniquely public-minded. So when it comes to actual political events, Arendt's politics are mainly a question of taste. And that's the case with her, the most controversial of her judgments on Hickman, where you get this phrase, the banality of evil. She thought Hickman, the key thing that explained Hickman was that he was a Philistine, that he didn't have any imagination. So hers really is Arendt's is a politics of judgment, of the intellectual as a connoisseur and a guardian of good taste. And just to finish up, so this kind of aesthetic politics appeals to the humanities, and that's not just because they find a convenient overlap between their profession and their politics, which is to say they get paid for having a radical politics and excuse from actual politics. It's also because it frames politics as a matter of taste whose sole end is making judgments. And it carries no obligation to think about social forces like work and material power relations. And there's a space where Arendt's purely discursive, immaterial, consequence-free, performative politics plays out today. And you can probably guess what it is. The closest we would have to it is something like Twitter. So there you go. I've run out of time, so I'll just say that's the account of the consequences of a humanities that ignores what humans spend most of their lives doing. Okay, I'll stop.
Ben, thank you very much. I just unspotlight you. My apologies, everyone. We're just right up at time here. Really interesting chat. Thank you for that. Is this another talk I know I'm going to have to listen to again and kind of slowly mull over and digest. So many interesting ideas in there. Just a really quick one, actually, from our fellow speaker, Richard. He just asks, does art making or poetry or whatever constitute action, or is it just machine thinking? And he means machine thinking like techne or manual labor, I mean.
Yeah, for Arendt, art is the model of action. So at the moment, so she thinks we live in this bleak world of labor because she's worried about labor movements and all of that. But the one glimmer of light is art, because you can see art objects and they're there. And so that's the model of action, which is, Arendt knew Benjamin, she knew Walter Benjamin, and she would have been familiar with Benjamin's point, his equation of the aestheticization of politics with fascism. But that's exactly where she goes. That's why I say hers is an aesthetics of politics, and that's why people like it, because you just sat there judging the world, and that's a radical act. But art is the model of action for her.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. I think at this point we should probably wrap up. We have got a break now. So we will see you on the other side in parallel session 4. That's at 3:35 in the two different strands. I just want to say in closing, thank you so much to our speakers. We've been taken through such an interesting range of different subjects and areas and different reflective thoughts, the personal, the political. It's been incredibly interesting. I just want to thank Alex in the Working Class Academics Network Operations Center, who is making all the technical magic happen. So thank you so much for your organization, Alex. It's gone really smoothly. And with that, I will leave you. Thank you all very, very much.